So for today, I'll be talking about the acute and chronic responses to heat stress, supporting both health and performance. And just to start us off, I'll put us into context. This happened a few weeks ago, and I'm sure many of you have seen this because it trended very much on Facebook.
Me. This is a horrible sight. Jonathan Brownlee has lost it now and has staggered to a stop at the side of the course, and Alistair's stopped to help him along. And Alistair is going to try and carry his brother home. Dramatic scenes in Cozumel as the Olympic champion carries his younger brother towards the podium.
Oh my God, I cannot believe what we are seeing here, Matt. Is this allowed? Is he allowed to help his brother? You know, is that part of the rules? I'm not too sure. We've never seen anything like this before.
Unbelievable scenes. Unbelievable scenes in Cozumel. To finish in second and third, but Johnny can hardly stand. And Alistair is having to drag him across the line and pushing him home for second. Johnny finishes in second.
So yes, he did finish in second place, but technically he wasn't allowed to offer assistance like that, but anyways, we won't get into that. So what that shows you is both the effect of heat stress on health and performance. Obviously his performance deteriorated quite rapidly, and his health was a bit compromised there. So obviously one of the things we want to avoid during exercise in the heat is exertional heat illness. It can develop over a sort of continuum, and it can be relatively benign as muscle cramps or heat cramps, which are obviously muscle spasm. And then it can develop into heat exhaustion, which is a more serious heat illness, but not necessarily as serious as the next one, which is heat stroke. But this is associated with an inability to maintain cardiac output and tachycardia, as well as hypotension. And it's often accompanied with dehydration, and often it also can mask a heat injury, which involves organ or tissue damage. But as I mentioned, the most severe exertional heat illness is heat stroke, and that's associated with significant central nervous system dysfunction, as well as a core temperature above 40 degrees, and sometimes well above 40 degrees Celsius. So this is obviously what we want to avoid while maximizing performance. So the discussion points that I wanted to address today revolve around neuromuscular function, so the connection between, I guess, the brain and muscle, and looking at central nervous system function under heat stress, and also cardiovascular function, because there's an intimate link between, obviously, thermoregulation with the redistribution of blood flow and performance in the heat. So these are the aspects I want to talk about. So when we talk about neuromuscular function, we talk about voluntary activation. And the way we look at this is through having subjects sit in a chair and do muscle contractions, and then we stimulate them to look at the level of voluntary activation. So as you can see over here, our subject is kind of strapped into the chair at the level of the hips, sometimes at the shoulders, and then they can do an isometric contraction by producing force. And it looks something like this. And what we do is, if force is suboptimal, when we stimulate the muscle or the brain, we can see an increase in force production, and we can compare that with one stimulation at rest to look at voluntary activation, which we can measure with different techniques, either the interpolated twitch technique or the central activation ratio. I won't get into that too much now, but that's the way we evaluate that. And the three most common ways to do this are with transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is not too pleasant, motor nerve stimulation, which is probably a bit less pleasant because that's it's quite painful, and then percutaneous muscle stimulation. So this is just to kind of put us into context. So when we think of hyperthermia and neuromuscular function, we think of hyperthermia-induced central fatigue. And technically, central fatigue is a progressive reduction in voluntary activation of the muscle during exercise. And I've highlighted the word voluntary because it is a voluntary contraction that we're doing. So if we're not producing as much force as we can, well, that means essentially that we're unwilling to fully activate the muscle. But there's also some research that suggests that it might be an inability to activate the muscle. So when we're talking about central fatigue, there's two potential mechanisms that are very different. Either you're unable or unwilling to fully contract the muscle, which is obviously very different. And I'll try to address that. There's been lots of studies done with that, and I'll present some of the studies that we've done. So we did a series of studies, and I'll present three of these studies today, looking at what happens with heat stress in terms of neuromuscular function, and potentially using that as mechanism for fatigue in the heat. So one of the first studies that we did is we looked at time trial exercise, which obviously is a more reproducible and ecologically valid mode of exercise or form of exercise than time to exhaustion, which also has its merits. But what we did is we had the subjects do a 40-kilometer time trial in hot and cool conditions. And prior to and after exercise, we had them do a 20-second MVC, so a 20-second contraction. And it looked like this. So essentially before exercise, in both conditions, force production obviously decreases during the contraction, but it was similar before exercise and was actually similar after exercise as well. When we measured voluntary activation, so the level of voluntary drive to the muscle, we saw that in cool conditions, before exercise, in cool conditions or in the heat, voluntary activation levels were similar, but they were around 94%. And that's because, as you can see here, when we stimulated, there was an increase in force at those 3 stimulation time points. And I've added that line there, so that black line, the red line, shows us that after exercise in hot and in cool conditions, so after a 40K time trial, and despite a difference in core temperature after exercise of 0.8 degrees Celsius, voluntary activation was similar. So we had a similar force production, similar voluntary activation. That's after a similar exercise, but very different core temperature after both of these. When we looked at that a bit further and looked at individual responses, we can see that after exercise, subject A in particular, who finished his time trial at a core temperature of 39.9 degrees Celsius, was able to maintain essentially complete voluntary activation. So when we stimulated, you can see there's no force increase. So this person was quite stoic, I should say, and quite strong. And he was obviously accustomed to doing the contractions, which we had the other subject as well familiarized with the contractions, but this subject in particular was quite stoic. And this is after doing his 40-kilometer time trial holding 393 watts, which, if you know a bit about cycling, it's pretty solid. So you can see that there is a difference between subjects. And when we measure voluntary activation, for example, we need to measure that peak there, but if we measure it from there or there or there, there's some differences with what level of voluntary activation we can get. So it's very important to define the method and explain the method that we're using when using this technique. So essentially, we concluded that an increase in core temperature of 0.8 degrees in the heat did not exacerbate the loss of force. And actually, we were able to determine that the decrease in voluntary activation only accounted for about 20% of the decrease in force production that we noted after exercise, with the rest occurring because of peripheral muscle fatigue due to the exercise itself. Now, in a follow-up study, what we wanted to do is we wanted to isolate the effect of exercise and heat stress. So what we did is we actively heated subjects, so they exercised to exhaustion at 60% VO2 max, and then we passively heated them in a bath till they got to a core temperature of 39.5. And what we did this time is we did a 45-second contraction. And as you can see here, prior to active or passive heating, force production decreased similarly. And interestingly, after both passive and active heating, force production was depressed, but also depressed similarly in both conditions. And as with the previous study, we saw a similar level of activation prior to exercise or passive heating, and also a similar level of voluntary activation at a similar core temperature, despite having reached that core temperature passively or actively. So in looking at that a little bit further, we normalized force production to the peak force achieved in the first few seconds of the contraction. And what we can see here, or in that one there, I'll switch sides, is that before exercise and after passive heating, the rate of force loss is similar. However, after exercise, the rate of force loss is greater, and this is probably due to the effect of heat stress combined with the effect of fatigue from the exercise itself compared to the passive heating bout where they just kind of sat in the bath there. So essentially, the loss of force occurred from both central and peripheral factors, with the combination of heat stress and exercise potentiating this rate of force loss. Now, in the last study I'll talk about for neuromuscular function, what we wanted to do here was wanted to eliminate the effect or the influence of voluntary activation. So we wanted to kind of eliminate the brain and trying to contract from the equation. So what we did is we passively and actively heated subjects to a core temperature of 38.5, and we produced on the muscle with percutaneous muscle stimulation an 8-second train of stimulation. And this is really not pleasant. If the other ones are unpleasant, this is not fun at all. Because what we did is essentially we had an 8-second train, and for 2 seconds each, we stimulated at continuously, but at 10, 20, 50, and 100 hertz. So it's basically kind of like a pinprick pricking you at 10 hertz, and then a bit faster, and then really much faster. So it's it's very much unpleasant. And the force that we were able to elicit at the 100 hertz reached about 75% of the MVC. So you're still producing lots of force just artificially with the stimulation. And what we can see here, the black line here and that black line there are pre-exercise and pre-passive heating. So obviously in control conditions, a similar force output. But after exercising in the heat to a core temperature of 38.5, we can see that force production decreases at each of the stimulation frequencies, especially at 10 and 20 hertz, which is indicative of low frequency fatigue. And in the heat, we see a similar decrease at 10 and 20 hertz, but at the high frequencies, 50 and 100, force output is similar, if not slightly higher. And what this does, in passive heating anyways, it shifts the force frequency curve or relationship to the right. What that means is that to elicit the same level of force output, so to reach 50% of peak force, rather than being in a cool muscle being stimulated at 15 hertz, you need a higher firing frequency to reach the same level of force. And this has to do with contractile speed. So a hot muscle is a faster muscle. So contractile speed, so contraction time and relaxation time is faster in terms of the muscle twitch response itself. And because the muscle twitch is faster, you need a higher firing frequency for twitches to summate to get force, to get a nice tetanus and force. Now, with exercise, we saw that this rightward shift was exacerbated, and this was likely because of an increase in contractile speed, but also with peripheral muscle fatigue, which has potentially different sources, and one of them is failure in excitation-contraction coupling. So essentially, that led us to finally conclude that exercise-induced hypothermia exacerbates the rightward shift in the force-frequency relationship relative to passive hypothermia, and that's due to a combination probably of increasing contractile speed and peripheral muscle fatigue. So if we put that into context, well, heat stress can lead to central fatigue due to suboptimal voluntary drive to the muscle, but as I demonstrated, even someone with a core temperature of 39.9 after exercise can still drive their muscle maximally if they're very motivated and accustomed to the task. Exercise exacerbates the loss of force, which is partly due to a decrease, low frequency, the development of low frequency fatigue. And this low frequency fatigue actually occurs within the physiological range. So when we do contract, maybe our instantaneous firing, motor neuron firing or motor unit firing can be upwards of 100, but that decreases very, very quickly down to about 20, 15 hertz towards the end of a sustained contraction. And obviously there is also an increase in contractile speed of the twitch itself with hyperthermia. So essentially, the loss of force production capacity in the heat has both central and peripheral origins. Now, if we look at chronic adaptations, there isn't all that much done in terms of muscle function. And something we've done very recently is put subjects in a hot room. So it's about 48, 50 degrees, which again is not pleasant. So a lot of this research is kind of not fun, but it's needed to heat people up. So they're in a room for about an hour at 48, 50 degrees, and we get them to a core temperature of 39 degrees. And we compared that with resting values of around 37 degrees. And we did a 5-second MVC and some resting stimulations. And what we saw is that prior to acclimatization, so prior to the 11 days of acclimatization, in the cool, so at in normothermia, so at a core temperature of 37 degrees, torque production was higher than in the hot condition, and that was due to obviously a lower RMS activity and lower voluntary activation. But what's interesting is after acclimatization or acclimation, we can see that for the same level of EMG activity and voluntary activation between the two, there's a higher force output during the contraction in both cool, when the subjects are cool, and when they're hot and they're heated as well. So that's quite interesting. And then what we do is we want to look at that more objectively with a muscle twitch. And we can see here in the gray, like the lighter gray, that's before acclimatization, so in the heat and in the cool here. And after acclimatization, when we do a resting twitch, we can see force production is higher in both the hot and cool conditions. So this hasn't been published yet. We've submitted that very recently, but essentially it could be due, based on some animal studies, an increase in muscle cross-sectional area, cell proliferation, and an increase in muscle protein content. But it's very interesting to note that with passive heat acclimation, we can potentially increase skeletal muscle force production, and that has implications for, or clinical implications, as well as rehabilitation applications. So for someone after surgery, if they want to maybe minimize the loss of force with immobilization or something like that, but putting them in passive heat stress may help attenuate the decrease in force production that they encounter. Now, in terms of cardiovascular function, well, obviously it's very well known that thermoregulation is very intimately linked, like I said, with blood flow and circulation, because we have to send blood to the periphery and so forth. So to control our core temperature around 37 degrees, whether we're in cold or hot conditions, we vasoconstrict in cool, therefore kind of maintaining central blood volume and limiting blood that is redistributed to the periphery relative to when it's hot outside. And we have significant vasodilation in the skin in order to kind of send blood to the periphery where it's kind of cooled in the skin, brought back to the core to keep our core around 37 degrees. Now, during exercise, that redistribution of blood affects aerobic capacity. And what we can see here is the distribution of blood. We can see this is obviously when we start an incremental test with a high core and high skin temperature. We can see that already skin temperature, blood flow is much greater in the heat than it is in cool conditions, and that has an effect on muscle blood flow. But ultimately, the effect is on cardiac output. So maximum cardiac output is reduced from about, in this subject anyways, from about 22 here to maybe 18. And cardiac output's a function of heart rate and stroke volume. And oftentimes we actually see higher maximum heart rates during exercise in the heat, whereas in this case it was 195 in cool and hot conditions. But stroke volume went from 114 to 95, and that's because, again, there's lots of blood redistributed to the periphery, reducing central blood volume and cardiac filling. Therefore, for each heartbeat, less blood's coming out, cardiac output is reduced. If maximal cardiac output is reduced, so is VO2 max. So we go from 3.8 maybe to 3 liters per minute. And what that does during exercise in the heat is that if someone's exercising at 200 watts, for example, and eliciting a VO2 of 2.5 liters per minute, well, they'll be exercising, if their VO2 is 3.8, at about 66% of their VO2 max. In the heat, however, for the same power output, same absolute VO2, because their VO2 max is decreased, they'll be exercising at a higher relative exercise intensity. So workload is the same, but relative intensity is very different. And we wanted to look at that in a series of studies, time trial studies. So what we did is we had subjects do a 40-kilometer time trial, again in hot and cool conditions, and because VO2 max doesn't decrease, early on in exercise, we can see that power output was similar, but after a while it decreased in the heat, and then that's that final end spurt towards the end because the subjects were aware of the distance left. And naturally, we had a higher core temperature, much higher rectal temperature in the heat, higher skin temperature right away, and a higher redistribution of blood flow towards the skin. And that impacted, interestingly, on heart rate. So even though power output was lower, because of that added thermal strain affecting cardiovascular strain, heart rate was higher, and stroke volume was lower because, again, central blood volume was reduced. And the decrease in stroke volume was greater than the increase in heart rate, and as such, cardiac output was reduced, even during that final end spurt where heart rate was maximum. Therefore, VO2 was lower during, and especially that peak VO2 during the end spurt. So that led us to conclude that a thermoregulatory mediated rise in cardiovascular strain exacerbates the decrease in VO2 max. Therefore, obviously, if our VO2 max is decreased, performance will be decreased. So in a follow-up study to this, what we wanted to do is we wanted to look at, okay, well, we know the VO2 max decreases, but how does that happen throughout a time trial in the heat? So what we did is we had subjects do 4 times 15-minute time trials with a 90-second end spurt at the end of each, 5 minutes rest. So they did that 4 times in 18 and 35 degrees. And this is the power output profile. So obviously power output decreased in both hot and cool condition, but much more so in the cool condition, in the heat. In terms of VO2, we can see here that although VO2 was significantly lower here, VO2 peak at after the first 15 minutes was similar, but after that it decreased significantly in the heat, or significantly more so in the heat than in cool conditions. As such, VO2 max decreases progressively. So it's not like it happens at one point, but it decreases progressively during exercise in both hot and cool conditions, and it's affected by the level of thermal strain. I guess the level of decrease is affected by the level of thermal strain, and the majority occurs in this study anyways after about 30 minutes of exercise. And again, that's because at the onset of exercise, if someone goes from a cold room to a hot room, while their core and skin temperature in the first 10-15 minutes will not be all that hot and will not affect the VO2 max. So subjects who do a VO2 max in cool conditions or in the heat and finish under 10-12 minutes, their VO2 max will not be affected unless they're preheated. So bringing this back to maybe neuromuscular function and looking at cerebral central nervous system and cerebral blood flow, we did a study looking at blood flow to the brain during time trial exercise. And what we saw here is that there is a significant decrease in blood flow to the brain in the heat compared to cool conditions. Having said that, it's not a dramatically lower decrease. What's more, essentially we found that obviously a greater increase in thermal strain decreased blood flow to the brain. This was associated with, again, a redistribution of blood to the periphery and a decrease in mean arterial pressure. However, other studies have found that there is a compensatory increase in brain oxygen extraction during exercise to exhaustion and during exercise in the heat. So it's unlikely that this decrease in brain blood flow would have resulted in some central fatigue or inhibitory effects on performance. So quick summary of this. Obviously, there is a redistribution of blood flow. Whether this is competition between the muscle and the skin for blood flow is something to talk about, or whether it's commensalism, which has been suggested by Larry Kenny, which is a quite interesting way to think about it. We can chat about that afterwards. And the rise in obviously in whole body temperature decreases maximum cardiac output, aerobic capacity, which has an effect on relative exercise intensity. And ultimately, the reduction in brain blood flow may be compensated for by an increase in metabolism. Now, if we look at chronic adaptations to heat stress, I won't spend too much time on this, but obviously everybody knows about heat acclimatization, and there's very lots of benefits from acclimatization, especially from a cardiovascular perspective. And part of that stems from an increase in plasma volume, which contributes to increased total blood volume and therefore central blood volume during exercise. And that helps with maintaining heart rate or even decreasing heart rate in the heat for a given exercise intensity. And that helps with thermal comfort as well. So the more you get used to exercising in the heat on a regular basis, the more comfortable you are. Skin temperature is reduced, which helps to decrease core temperature as well. Sweat rate increases, and this may sound counterintuitive because if you sweat more, you may get dehydrated, but really if you sweat more and that sweat evaporates, you might get cooled down much more as well. An interesting side effect of that as well is that sweat sodium concentration, electrolyte concentration is reduced with that increase in sweat rate and the adaptation. And ultimately, exercise capacity is increased in the heat. This is just an example of some study we did in Qatar a few years ago with Danish cyclists. And you can see that before they came to Qatar, they did a time trial in Denmark. It was 8 degrees. And then they came to Qatar. Well, first of all, their performance was quite good. These are amateur cyclists, so to hold around that is pretty solid. Then they came to Qatar. After a few days, this is what their performance looked like. So obviously, a significant effect of heat stress. After 1 week in the heat, performance improved dramatically. And after 2 weeks, it improved even more. So acclimation, obviously, or heat acclimatization in this case, because it was done outdoors, does have tremendous benefits. And obviously with that, it reduces the risk of heat illness. It doesn't prevent the risk of heat illness altogether, but it helps with minimizing that risk. A new space that's quite interesting is using heat or passive heat in terms of with clinical populations or things of that nature. So it's been shown recently that passive heat therapy improves endothelial function, arterial stiffness, and blood pressure in sedentary individuals, and that repeated warm water immersion induces similar cerebrovascular adaptations to 8 weeks of moderate intensity training. So this is an interesting space that is kind of developing. There's some interesting research coming out with that. So ultimately, from an acute perspective, from neuromuscular function, we can see that, yes, there can be hyperthermia-induced central fatigue, which is a reduction in voluntary drive, but the reduction in force occurs not only from central aspects, but also from peripheral aspects. And fatigue is very much context-specific. So obviously we look at putting someone in a chair and having them do a contraction, but that's a very specific mode of exercise. It's static, it's maximal, and no one, when doing cycling exercise, will be at a maximum intensity, muscle-wise anyways, for 2 minutes or 40 seconds or 30 seconds. So there's lots of stuff happening there from a metabolic perspective, from the activation of group 3 and 4 muscle afferents that
doesn't quite happen during dynamic exercise. So it's important to be careful when inferring a form of fatigue from static exercise, for example, to dynamic exercise. Just a little side note. With chronic adaptations to heat stress, well, potentially there's an improvement in contractile function by improving force production capacity. In terms of cardiovascular function, well, I'm just finished talking about that, but that redistribution of blood, the decrease in aerobic capacity, the increase in relative exercise intensity, and ultimately, by acclimatizing, we can help performance, but also help reduce the risk of exertional heat illness. So thank you very much for listening, and I'd like to take the funding sources and affiliations for which I've worked with in the last few years. Thank you. So because our presentations, like I said, are slightly different, we're going to stay up after each of our presentations to take any questions. So if anybody has any questions for me, please feel free to fire away. Or not.
Hi, Alicia Harvey from the University of Ottawa. Thank you very much. I just have a couple of questions. One, I'm wondering what your sample sizes were roughly for some of your studies. Two, I'm wondering if you looked at the differences in body fat percentage in the individuals and seeing if there's an effect difference based on body fat percentage. And three, because women typically have a different body fat percentage overall than men, did you just use men in the studies? Did you look at women as well, and were their outputs different?
First question, our sample sizes for each of the studies is about 10 to 12 athletes, roughly for all of them. Body fat percentages in the first few studies we did, but these were all recreational cyclists. Well, I shouldn't say recreational, very, very strong recreational cyclists. So
300 watts.
Yeah, well, no, that was one. Yeah, that was one guy, 390, not all of them. We didn't measure it, and I think if I remember correctly, varied maybe with the calipers from maybe 8% to 18%, something like that. Okay. So there wasn't much change there. In terms of women, in some of the later studies, we did use one woman, but she was amenorrheic because she was a cyclist, so she had a similar body fat, and she was, just as strong, if not stronger than some of the guys.
In your opinion, do you think that you would see different outputs if they, A, either had different body fat percentages, or B, if you did look at women specifically, do you think that they would have a different outcomes?
In terms of what measures specifically?
Cardiac output was my primary interest, but I'm just generally interested in seeing what your thoughts are.
So the effect of body fat percentage on cardiac output, that's a good question. I'm not too sure. I mean, the whole cardiac output and cardiovascular response has to do with, I guess, the intensity of the exercise and the power being produced. So, to be honest, I'm not quite sure if someone who's at 10% body fat or 40% body fat would have a different cardiac output. Maybe it has to do with vascularization in the skin, if it's greater, with trying to lose more heat.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm Peter Ollick. I'm from Red Deer. I'm an emergency physician, and I'm interested in the. Take this out here. There, I can stand up now.
We're almost the same height.
Yeah, exactly. What I'm interested in is your interpretation of the cardiovascular dysfunction being more of a peripheral or the cardiac dysfunction being the heart itself versus a central mediator, even though I guess your test, the people you're testing were showing that they could still perform tasks properly. But the protective mechanism for the heart, basically from what I can see from cardiovascular physiology, from what we know in the emergency department, is that you can have somebody functioning intellectually at a very high level, and the heart can be, they can have central dysfunction, especially when you look at when your heart rates are dropping. The heart rate is mediated by a central mechanism, I'm wondering, in the brain. What I'm wondering is how would that be starting to decrease with heat and it not being a central mediator that would be driving that?
The changes in cardiac function?
Yes, in cardiac function.
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, if individuals like that get to a very high core temperature, and there is that redistribution of blood and that inability to maintain cardiac output, obviously that's associated with hypotension. So, I mean, that's probably one of the defense mechanisms as well, is to become hypotensive and fall to the ground, so blood is equilibrated. But in terms of cardiac function itself, that's difficult to say. We have a PhD student at the moment who's actually doing his studies on cardiac function with acclimatization, so we might find something there.
Could I ask, with regard to regular temperatures or cold temperatures, cooler temperatures, and cardiac function being higher, part of your hypothesis that there's potentially it could be peripheral vascular resistance with the heat that would be causing there'd be competition with trying to get rid of the heat. Has there been any talk about doing anything like with histamine release to go to stimulate the skin so that on cooler temperatures you could still have that competition and you could see what the impact would be of that?
That's interesting. Yeah, you could almost do that as well with kind of a skin suit as well to kind of heat up the skin. It's not something I've thought about, but it's definitely interesting with
Okay.
keeping the core lower and try to increase skin blood flow.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else?
All right, thank you very much. So from heat stress, we'll go to cold stress, and I'll read François' bio from my phone here. So Dr. François Haman is a professor of the University of Ottawa. He's actually used to teach me, in the 1800s. Yeah. That makes us both look old, but anyways. His research targets basic aspects of human nutrition and energetics, from mechanisms to application. His work aims at establishing principles that dictate fuel use and provide strategies to improve health and performance or enhance survival using alterations in nutrition and physical training. His current work integrates metabolic measurements, methodologies to quantify human responses to climate change. So please welcome François Haman.
Well, hi everybody. I'm really excited to be in Victoria. This is my first visit. I've heard from Victoria multiple times by guys like Julien and Matt White. I have a bit of a cold, okay, so I don't know if it's a cold rain from yesterday, which brings me to my topic, which is the metabolic effects of cold exposure, fact or fiction. And every time I put that title up, I always think about my grandmother, because my grandmother used to say, never expose yourself to the cold. Always make sure you dress well, especially in April. And so every time I think about this, I always go, I'm talking about the benefits of cold exposure, but people will go, especially my grandmother would be going, you're nuts. I mean, there's nothing good with cold. So you're gonna see we're not talking about extreme cold exposure. We actually now can regulate a lot of these cold responses. Other people are convinced, there's nothing to kind of prove here, that cold exposure will burn fat. So if you put cold pads on your bum, okay, and you can find that on the internet, there's actually multiple sites, and you can see the before and after pictures. So I've never been able to kind of see the difference, even though I look intensively. But there is supposed to be a difference between these pre and post values. So, but no jokes, and this all stems from the brown fat work that is started. So I will talk about brown fat, because I've been involved in brown fat research for the last 6 years. And a lot of these new products, and you know the nice sentence, I'm freezing my butt off as I'm writing this, stems from all the brown fat work that's been going on for years. Most of the work that I do focuses on the energy demands of extreme environments. And even though I've been focusing on cold exposure, I did heat exposure also, I've been involved in exercise, hypoxia. And I do chronic disease in collaborations with a lot of people. Most of the techniques that I use will always combine indirect calorimetry with isotopes. We will look at the oxidation rates of food, so using isotopes again to be able to look at the oxidation rates of different food substances. But also recently I've had access to PET-CT imagery, and it's been incredible. So anybody using PET-CT, you're gonna like the images. It's been amazing, going from whole body and being able to see stuff that within the body. It's been pretty incredible. So today I'm going to focus mainly on the cold exposure. So maintaining core temperature requires a fine balance between heat production and heat loss. Most of the processes of heat transfer, radiation, convection, and conduction, and evaporation, or physical process of heat transfer influenced by skin temperature. Most of the focus of my work is on shivering and non-shivering thermogenesis. In theory, if the cold is not too intense during exercise, you're producing enough heat to be able to maintain thermal balance. So most of the work I'll be talking about today is the effects on, is the metabolic cost of non-shivering and shivering thermogenesis. Shivering thermogenesis is really unpleasant. It's involuntary contractions, they're asynchronous. You're not going to start walking when you're shivering. The maximal intensity, and I'll make a small comparison after this, and you'll see in a graph, the maximal intensity of shivering ever reported is around 5 to 6 times resting metabolic rate, which, by the way, is the same in birds, the same in rats. And this value seems to be consistent throughout the animal species. The process of non-shivering thermogenesis, the main one that's been a lot of people have focused on has been brown fat, but there are also futile cycles that can be activated, which have an ATP cost. And these futile cycles can actually increase metabolic rate. And Valorant in '99 actually showed that the TAG-NIFA cycle was increased during cold exposure. But there could be also other metabolic processes. There's a lot of any cell producing heat that is stimulated during cold exposure would be contributing to non-shivering thermogenesis. So in babies before the age of 1, there's actually little information known about their capacity to shiver, but brown fat plays an amazing role. And brown fat can actually stimulate heat production by twofold. So babies can go almost entirely on the brown fat activation to be able to stimulate heat production. As babies age, it was thought that after the age of 1, brown fat would drop to almost nothing, and in adults, the contribution of brown fat to non-shivering thermogenesis would be very small. And there's been a lot of research done in shivering, and I'm going to show you a bit of results on this, but when I started doing this work, we always assumed that non-shivering thermogenesis was not occurring during cold exposure. And I've written this multiple times in papers, in my initial papers in 2000 up to probably 2009. And then after we found brown fat, it became extremely clear that that sentence could not be used anymore. So nowadays, we've got to be extremely careful when we talk about the contribution of non-shivering thermogenesis. In the elderly, which is a bit sad, there's actually very little information. There's very few studies that have been done with cold exposure, which is probably because my grandmother told him not to go in the cold. But there's actually very few studies that were done during cold exposure, which is very disappointing because they would be more vulnerable actually to cold exposure. So most of the effector response, which would be cardiovascular response, the stimulation of brown fat, shivering, will happen with an integration of skin temperature and core temperature. And the core temperature will be detected in the hypothalamus, in the preoptic area. And the actual response, the intensity of the response, will be the integration of this stimuli. So a lot of people think that you cannot shiver unless core temperature goes down, which is not the case. You can actually stimulate shivering with no change in core temperature in compensable conditions. And you can actually go as high as 3 times your resting metabolic rate with no change in core temperature, and even you can get increases in core temperature because people are shivering so much, and they will still keep on shivering as long as skin temperature is down. So going on this idea, a lot of people have used different ways. So during exercise, you can use ergometers. There's treadmills, there's ergocycles, there's all these ergometers you can use. During cold exposure, there's been no standardization in terms of how to expose people to the cold. Some people have done it with cold rooms. Some people have done it by throwing people in cold water, which you get very different conditions. So if I put somebody in a cold room, there's a chance it's going to be compensable because the intensity is not going to be as great. If I throw somebody in cold water, within 90 minutes, the person's going to go down to pretty much 35 to 34.5 degrees Celsius. I opted to use a different system. I opted to use a cooling suit, which is just a bit like a Batman suit. It's going to be funny in a few seconds. So it's basically, using this Batman suit, I've been able to create compensable conditions. And I've been able to control the intensity of shivering without any core temperature change. So I'll tell you a little bit about that suit, which was initially made to help helicopter pilots during Desert Storm, and it was basically to maintain the temperature because the cockpit would become so warm that they needed a cooling system. They're actually used in Formula One cars now. So a lot of this cooling system allows me to clamp skin temperature. And most of the studies I'll be talking about were all done using this suit. So this is my treadmill. It's my cold exposure treadmill. So what that allows me to do, and there was a professor in biology, Tom Moon, way back, that used to tell me, when you expose somebody to temperature, you're going to affect a lot of things. So try to control your temperature as much as you can to be able to control the condition that you're trying to expose the subject at. So using the suit and not changing core temperature became a major advantage to me. So all the exposure we're going to be talking about, we're not talking about sub-zero conditions, because you know skin can freeze sub-zero. So we're not talking about these conditions. We're talking about conditions that would be more like fall temperature. And actually some of these conditions could reproduce in a house just by decreasing the temperature slightly. And I'm going to talk about acclimation later, but you're going to see that we're not talking about extreme cold exposure at all. So if I put water at different temperature in the suit, and you can see the decrease in skin temperature. So if I put the water at 5 degrees Celsius, I can bring mean skin temperature to 26. If I put the water at 10, I get mean skin temperature around 28. If I put the water at 18, I get skin temperature around 30. All this time, there's no change in core temperature. But if I look at changes in heat production, if the water is at 18, I'm going to increase heat production by 1.7 times resting metabolic rate. Temperature at 10 degrees is going to go up to 2.5 resting metabolic rate. And if I put the temperature at 5 degrees Celsius, I will go up at 3.5. And these measurements are actually very consistent. And I can reproduce them very precisely between trials. So I can actually do multiple trials in subjects and reproduce the same response over and over again, which is pretty useful when you're trying to look at treatments. At the bottom here is the shivering response, and it's expressed as percentage of maximal voluntary contraction. And you can see that 18 degrees Celsius mean shivering intensity is going to be around 1%. If I go to 10 degrees Celsius with 2.5 resting metabolic rate, I'm going to be close to 10%, and I can go up to 15% afterwards. Okay, so that allows me to create my treadmill for cold exposure. So most of the data I'll be showing you and all the brown fat work we've been doing has been using this suit. So once you have your treadmill or your capacity to control skin temperature, then you can test all kinds of stuff. So I initially looked at what was the effect of any modifications in food consumption on muscle response. So essentially, if I change diet, if I change intensity, what is the effect on the contribution of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins? And if I change these values, am I going to have any effect on muscle activity? We have to remember that with shivering, there's no performance. Okay, so even if people think they shiver better than others, it's actually pretty hard to distinguish who shivers better. So the only way to be able to do it is actually to look at the intensity. There's another factor that comes in, which is something that I kind of found by accident, playing with the data, and I'll show you what that is, but it's actually the ratio between burst shivering and continuous shivering. So when you shiver, I don't know how many people have shivered here, but it's super fun. One thing you're going to notice is as you're shivering, there's going to be low intensity shivering, little tremors, and then once in a while, you're going to get big bursts of shivering. And these bursts of shivering actually recruit different muscle fiber types. And so I'm just going to show you some of, So one thing I just want to mention, because carbohydrates, as everybody knows during exercise, play a very important role, especially when it comes to depletion of muscle glycogen reserves, I did look at what happens during cold exposure if we start modifying the proportion of carbohydrates. So I looked using isotope methodologies, what is the contribution of muscle glycogen and liver glycogen to total carbohydrate oxidation, and what happens if I change the availability through depletion, loading of carbohydrates, or through ingestion of glucose. So again, I'm going to show you what results we got from this. And I use, of course, EMG to look at shivering intensity and the pattern of shivering. So before we get too far, I just want to show you how we can compare exercise to shivering. And as everybody knows, absolute values are very important because sometimes when you go with relative values, you do lose a bit of information. So if we look at this, if I compare my studies that were done with the effect of intensity, and we have here low intensity shivering and high intensity shivering, to results, so we have carbohydrate oxidation, lipid oxidation, muscle glycogen oxidation, plasma glucose oxidation, as a function of heat production, and as a function of percent of VO2 max. If we compare a cold exposure study to an exercise study, so this study is by Van Loon 2001, what we can see that really sticks out initially, which is not that surprising, but we're actually dealing with very low rates of oxidation. So what you see during exercise is much higher absolute rates of oxidation compared to shivering. So when it comes to glycogen depletion, of course, it's going to take much longer to deplete glycogen reserves. And this is well shown here, where you can see that during exercise, the oxidation of muscle glycogen is actually really high compared to what you would see during shivering. So the question could be, are carbohydrates that essential to be able to maintain shivering? The other thing that sticks out, if you look at the relative contribution of muscle glycogen to plasma glucose, it's actually pretty similar between exercise and shivering. And if you look at the crossover point, so the point at which you switch from lipids to carbohydrates, so basically the 50% mark, which is around 60% of VO2 max during exercise, drops down to about 20% of VO2 max during shivering. So we are using more carbohydrates during shivering. And we're using carbohydrates at levels that for the same muscles being recruited, we're using carbohydrates at levels that are much lower than what you would see during exercise. Why is that? Well, one of the things that comes out from the shivering pattern is if you look at this is a 90-second shivering pattern. So most of the studies I conduct will last 120 minutes in the cold, so 2 hours to up to 3 hours. This is 90 seconds of this. So if you look at the signal entirely, you actually don't see this. You really have to focus on one little section to be able to see it. And what you see is that shivering pattern. So within that shivering pattern, there's low continuous shivering, and there are these little bursts of shivering. Bursts of shivering has been associated with the recruitment of type 2 fibers. And as you know, type 2 fibers are glycolytic, meaning that they're going to be using more carbohydrates when they're recruited. Continuous shivering tends to recruit type 1 fibers, and this was actually determined through indwelling electrodes looking at motor unit recruitment. And so the type 1 fibers can actually select, so they can actually recruit, they can actually oxidize lipids, carbohydrates, or amino acids, where for type 2 fibers, most of the fuel that will be used will be carbohydrates. So if I look at the relationship between burst shivering and carbohydrate oxidation, there's actually a very strong correlation between the two. But what's interesting about this is that these are all different individuals. So these are 8 different individuals that shiver differently but produce the same amount of heat. So one thing that I found through this study was actually there's tremendous variability in the way muscles are being recruited by individual subjects, and tremendous variability in the fuels that are being used. So the question could be, could that have an impact on muscle glycogen depletion? So if muscle glycogen is essential and you're bursting more, you would be depleting the reserves more quickly. So if I take these same subjects again, and I look at burst rate and compare it to burst rate as a function of time. Oh, sorry, I don't have the label here, but this is basically the hours until you get glycogen depletion. So muscle glycogen depletion, how many hours it would take. And this is the oxidation rate of muscle glycogen at each of these burst rates. So what you get is if I take subject number 3, who's bursting about 3 times a minute, he's going to be using, so he will be bursting 3 times a minute using less muscle glycogen, so that means that time to depletion is going to be much longer. If I take subject 2 is bursting at 8 times per minute. His glycogen utilization rate is much higher, so it's about at least 4 times higher than what you get for subject 3. So his time to glycogen depletion, if muscle glycogen is essential for shivering, would occur much quicker. So the next step, obviously, is to deplete reserves. So if I deplete glycogen reserves, would I have any effect on the capacity to burst shiver or even on shivering intensity? So I performed this study where we depleted glycogen reserves. So we had normal subjects with normal reserves. We depleted glycogen reserves through exercise and diet, and then we increased glycogen reserves as much as we could. And what you see, and so I put that in percentage, so you kind of lose the perspective in terms of heat production, but heat production was the same in the 3 conditions. There is no difference in heat production between these conditions. So the subjects are using dramatically different fuels and producing exactly the same amount of heat. question could be, is that going to affect my burst shivering rate? And it doesn't. I tried all kinds of ways to find differences in muscle recruitment in depleted subjects and loaded subjects and could never find any differences in pattern, percent contribution of burst shivering to total signal. I tried all kinds of onset of shivering and nothing was different. So essentially individuals or humans are capable of producing heat using very different fuels without modifying their recruitment pattern for muscle fibers. So if I look at how much time it would take to deplete muscle glycogen reserves, if I take the subjects and keeping in mind that we had the same burst rate, what we get for the depleted group, it would take a bit more than 15 hours because you're oxidizing muscle glycogen more slowly for the same given burst rate. If you take if you take the loaded group, there seems to be a slight advantage, which is probably not significant, but there seems to be a slight advantage, but you see that they're very similar. So there doesn't seem to be any optimal fuel mix to be able to maintain heat production during cold exposure in humans. So the next step would be knowing that carbohydrate oxidation is sustained through muscle glycogen, is sustained through hepatic glycogen. What would happen if I start feeding people glucose during cold exposure? And you guys are probably very familiar with a lot of studies that were done during exercise looking at this. So these would be similar studies. So essentially, if I start providing glucose orally, and that could be eventually in the form of survival rations or any type of food that would be provided during survival conditions, would I be able to reduce the rate of muscle glycogen utilization? So I'm just going to condense these results together because we did run quite a few studies on this. So there are two aims to these studies: measuring maximal rate of exogenous glucose oxidation. So what is the maximal rate of oxidation coming from ingestion? And could we actually reduce the use of muscle glycogen reserves? So even if muscle glycogen is not essential during shivering, if you're in a survival condition and you need to run eventually or get out of the situation you're in, you might want to preserve your muscle glycogen reserves. So this played actually a twofold role when it comes to this. So remembering that with shivering intensity, you get an increase in muscle glycogen use. As you change the glycogen status from depleted to loaded, you increase the use of muscle glycogen. If I provide glucose, and I'm just going to focus on a few things because there's quite a few bars here, but if I look at ingestion of glucose at 400 milligrams per minute, and that was calculated based on plasma glucose oxidation rate, so we basically replaced what the liver was providing. If we give glucose at 400 milligrams per minute, or if we give glucose at 800 milligrams per minute, there's actually no difference. So meaning that the oxidation is sustained whether I give 800 or 400. So providing 400 milligrams of glucose per minute seems to be sufficient to be able to maintain carbohydrate oxidation. But what happens if I give glucose and fructose in combination? Remembering that they're using different transport systems to be able to provide glucose. If I use 400 milligrams of glucose and 400 milligrams of fructose, I get a significant decrease in the use of muscle glycogen reserves. So I'm just going to go to the conclusion of these studies because I know that was kind of, it's hard without going through all the details to be able to get the full grasp of this. But the conclusion is that regardless of the glucose dose or timing of the ingestion, it's always better to provide glucose and fructose in combination to optimize oxidation of carbohydrates and decrease the use of endogenous reserves. And just a little parenthesis, this is actually survival rations that are provided in boats and planes. And these survival rations represent about a fourth of what you need to survive during cold exposure. So next time you fly in a plane or you go on a boat, make sure you bring food because you might be in trouble. So taking the talk now to bat research. So non-shivering thermogenesis since 2009 has gone into a huge boom. And in the obesity world, so maybe a lot of you know Denis Richard. Denis Richard is actually a chair of obesity from Université Laval. And there's been a big interest in trying to use brown fat to reduce the incidence of, or for treatment of obesity. So Denis Richard approached two groups. So there's the group from Laval University, who does nuclear imagery under the supervision of André Carpentier, and my group from Ottawa. And we became known as the Batmen. So through these studies, we were able to get into details and try to look at clinical importance of cold exposure. And through this clinical importance of cold exposure, there are two main things that have been the focus of all these studies. So whatever studies that have been done on that, people are trying to identify, are we able to use brown fat, which is stimulated by cold exposure, to be able to increase energy expenditure, which could probably lead to a certain extent to weight loss. The other idea, and this is more linked to type 2 diabetes and dyslipidemia, could we actually use cold exposure and the stimulation of brown fat to reduce blood glucose and to reduce blood lipids? And this, during shivering, is thought to occur mainly in brown adipose tissue. So most of these studies have been focusing on brown adipose tissue as the main target for disposal of glucose and lipids during cold exposure. But one thing we have to keep in mind is that even though we think that when you stimulate, even at low intensities, shivering does not occur, shivering does occur. And I'm going to show you results on this, but there's actually always brown fat activation simultaneously to muscle activation. So this activation actually occurs together. So we've been using positron emission tomography and computed tomography to be able to look at whole body tissue metabolism, but also in Sherbrooke, they've been able to do static measurements and dynamic isotope measurements. So I'm just going to go, I know this is kind of a bit too much, but I just want to focus on the isotopes that we actually use. We use two protocols, and in these two protocols, we're going to be using different isotopes. Some of these isotopes will inform us on the metabolic rate of the tissue, and this isotope is acetate. So acetate 11 we use to be able to get an idea of the metabolic rate of brown adipose tissue. FDG is used to be able to get an idea of glucose uptake in tissues. And in protocol 1, we only use these isotopes. So we're going to do the dynamic measurements and the static measurements. So static measurements, and I'm going to show you images, are going to be full body scans. The dynamic images are only obtained from an 18 centimeter window, which includes brown fat. In the second protocol, in the same subject, so they basically come back twice, which is a huge advantage when you have a cooling suit, because you can actually reproduce the conditions. We're going to do acetate before cold exposure to get our baseline, but also use an isotope called FTHA, which is an analog of fatty acid, which is going to enter the tissue but not be oxidized. So we're going to be doing dynamic measurements, and then we're going to do whole body measurements. So again, we will get entry rate of fatty acids throughout the body. And this is what we find. And I'm just going to kind of bring it together in a few sentences, but essentially, if you look at the net uptake of glucose, the net uptake of NEFA, what you see is brown adipose tissue does uptake glucose, and brown adipose tissue does uptake fatty acids. And probably the most important finding out of these two, which is not surprising because it's a tissue that's alive, so it's going to be using fuel, but also that the metabolic rate of brown adipose tissue is increased during cold exposure. So not only is brown adipose tissue present, but it's also an active tissue. So in adult humans, we know now that brown adipose tissue can be stimulated in young individuals below the age of 35 100% of the time and will be active. Another thing that we see through these measurements, and I'm going to present it through that correlation and then kind of present it a bit differently, but through this correlation between muscle activity and brown fat volume, what we see is the more brown fat a person has, the less shivering that person will be using during cold exposure. But one thing that probably sticks out in everybody's mind is only 6 subjects first. And the second thing that probably sticks out is there's actually 2 groups of subjects. And heat production is identical between all these subjects. So there seems to be individuals with more brown fat and individuals with less brown fat, and this is for similar age groups, similar morphology, and these individuals are actually amazingly similar. If I take all the studies that have been done to date on brown fat, what we see is brown fat on average is about 68 milliliters, and the variability is, and the variability is tremendous. So between the studies, you can see it can go from 200 grams down to almost nothing. So there's a lot of variability in this value. The other thing that you see through this imagery is even though we thought that only peripheral muscles were involved in shivering, there's actually deep muscles that are involved in shivering. And you can see one of them, and that's why you get neck pains during cold exposure, is longus coeli. And longus coeli and psoas are amazingly involved during cold exposure. So there's actually very deep muscles that are involved. If I look at the uptake of glucose, between brown fat and skeletal muscles, we're not even on the same scale. The uptake of glucose in comparison to all the muscle mass that you have, skeletal muscles will uptake 50% of the glucose being produced, where for brown fat, it's going to be about 1%. So in comparison to muscle, the brown fat contribution to the uptake of glucose is very small. So is there a way to stimulate brown fat activity? And hopefully this works. Tu peux-tu partir la vidéo? Oh, cool. Okay. So if I take a subject, this is before cold exposure, and he's been exposed with the suit at very low intensity, you can barely see brown fat. So you can see there are no patches of typical brown fat. What you actually see here during cold exposure is the longus coeli, which are actually neck muscles that are being activated. If I expose the person for 2 hours at 10 degrees Celsius for 18 consecutive days, what I see is a Christmas tree appearing. So this is all brown fat. And just partir la vidéo. And you can see the suprascapular stores. You can see all the way along the spinal column, the serenal glands will have brown fat. This is the same subject after 18 days. So one of the issues that we might have, so what we found from our studies is not only do you increase the volume, but you also increase the activity after this 18-day exposure. So what we see is the volume is being increased, but also shivering intensity is decreasing. So as we go through cold acclimation, we produce the same amount of heat, and we can actually decrease the amount of shivering that is involved. So I'm not that patient. I'm not going to do 18 days every time I want to cold acclimatize somebody. So I actually recently been doing 7-day cold acclimations at 14 degrees Celsius in cold water, which is totally unpleasant. So either the person makes it to an hour or core temperature ends up at 35 and then we stop the trial. When they first start the 7-day, they can do the full hour. After 7 days, they can actually do the full hour. When you expose them using the cooling suit, you get exactly the same response when it comes to skin temperature and core temperature. But what you see is shivering is significantly decreased for the same heat production. And by definition, this means that non-shivering thermogenesis has been increased. And so we can achieve basically what we do in 18 days using a much more extreme, and I had a video, but it didn't, for some reason, didn't make it, which shows how intense this would be. But we can actually achieve it within 7 days. Another way that I've used to stimulate the activity of non-shivering thermogenesis is using green tea extracts. And this is a horse dose, which is basically 1,600 milligrams of EGCG, which is catechins, and 600 milligrams of caffeine. And when you expose people to the cold, when that supplement is being given, what you're going to see is an increase in heat production and a 10% increase in heat production and a 20% decrease in shivering intensity. And that's just giving one dose of green tea extracts. So now the question becomes, most people would say, well, this is probably all that increase in non-shivering thermogenesis might be related to brown fat. But looking at some of the data, it's hard to know exactly what the contribution of brown fat would be. But there could also be muscle involved, so non-shivering thermogenesis being stimulated after cold acclimation in muscle, and there could also be other tissues that are involved. So when you stimulate non-shivering, you will increase chances of survival by reducing shivering intensity, which will improve thermal comfort. It will also increase potentially heat production and increase survival time. So that has become an important focus for survival rations during cold exposure. So the $1,000 question is, could cold exposure make people leaner, and could cold exposure decrease type 2 diabetes? I don't think we're going to be using cold to solve the obesity epidemic, and it will remain still that food and physical activity will play an important role. When it comes to type 2 diabetes, medication will play a role. Maybe to a certain extent, cold exposure, and we're not there yet, could actually play a very important role, maybe in stimulating heat production or other processes within the body. So I'd just like to thank my collaborators, my students that were involved in this project, and yes, Christy and Alicia, we got an NIH grant, so we're going to be doing cold women too. So all the studies that I've shown here were men, but we are starting cold women this fall. Thank you.
If anybody has any questions, we'll take them now.
Hi, very interesting talk. In the 18-hour cold exposure, have you done some extrapolations to calculate what the weight loss would be if there was repeated clinical treatments?
No, so we didn't get into this, but this is definitely the direction that this is going to take.
You might have mentioned this, but I kind of missed the where is brown fat usually predominantly in the body?
So brown fat in the body, so if you take a rat, there's very precise paths that are located throughout the body. In humans, most of the brown fat seems to be in suprascapular areas and all the way along the spinal column and over serenal glands. So these are the main depots, but you can actually get browning, so that's a different conversation. So when it comes to brown fat, you got to think that we're using certain thresholds to identify it. But there's actually a lot of people looking into browning right now, trying to see, can we actually increase the amount of brown fat in other tissues? And what people have been seeing is actually you can get browning in adipose tissue that would be between muscle fibers in muscle. So there seems to be different depots that could be created elsewhere, but the main depots would be along the spinal column, suprascapular, and over the serenal glands. And there's also a bit of brown fat that could be located around the heart.
So the peripheries are basically void of brown fat for the most part.
Yeah. So basically, you're taking care of the core.
So, and that's exactly, yeah. So that's why we have, I guess, vasoconstriction peripherally.
Mm-hmm. And it probably plays a role also when it comes to making sure that these areas remain warm for any nervous activity. So the nervous system is being protected very clearly when you see the spots where the brown fat is being activated. So even though we've been looking at energy expenditure, there might be totally different role that brown fat is playing in humans that haven't been explored, which could be linked to motor control and other processes.
So can an adaptive effect of if you're exposed to some amount of cold over a period of time, would you start to establish or build brown fat? Is there a possibility of building brown fat?
So brown fat, what we've seen, 18 days, we can double the amount of brown fat in the same individual and triple the activity.
So then would that be something to look forward to with early onset diabetes or like a type 2 type of diabetes?
Mm-hmm. So there's data that I didn't show here, but actually the prevalence of brown fat has been determined. So as BMI goes up, brown fat quantity goes down. As ambient temperature goes down, you're going to get more brown fat. But what's kind of puzzling everybody is for type 2 diabetics, there's actually less brown fat. But I didn't show that data, but one thing that we found was actually the uptake of glucose through FDG, so the isotope that we use to detect brown fat, is being reduced. But we also saw lower acetate activity in people in type 2 diabetes. So there's definitely something going on in type 2 diabetes.
So from your experience, because you're the researcher in this, what would be kind of a therapeutic model that you could look at possibly as a potential in the future for people with early onset diabetes, younger people with using cold versus just exercise, exercise and cold?
Yeah, so what would be important is to be able to actually redo some of the studies in type 2 diabetics to be able to look maybe at different levels of diabetes and to be able to look at the differences in the amount of brown fat and the decreases that you could see longitudinally. Like if you expose a person long term, if you would be able to see differences.
Thank you.
Thank you, François. So our next speaker is... Our next speaker is Professor Matthew White, who's an exercise and environmental physiologist in the Department of Biomedical Physiology and Kinesiology at Simon Fraser University. Basic and applied research in his lab is focused on human physiological responses at rest, as well as during exercise and altitude, during undersea diving, as well as during cold and heat stress exposure.
Thanks very much, Julien. Humbled and honored to present today. Is there just briefly, I'd like to make a dedication of this presentation. Sorry. She's here for us in spirit, but no longer in body. I dedicate this to my mom, Marion Pearl Wardle. Okay. Outline for my talk today is going to be a lot more fun than what we've seen for these people that are put in the heat and the cold and they're suffering. Because we're going to put them down at depth and we're going to make them happy and we're going to give them laughing gas. So I'm going to start out talking about safety and survival in the offshore, and I'm going to take my presentation right from Atlantic Canada on the east coast, the farthest point east in North America, all the way across the country. And we'll start with some work on breath hold diving and egress and safety in the offshore. We'll move and talk about nitrogen narcosis and performance of our control of breathing at depth. And then I'll finish up in an area where we'll look at the effects of heat and nitrogen narcosis on performance, which I think will bring it nicely into the focus of exercise physiologists. So years ago in Newfoundland, there was a tragedy, the Ocean Ranger disaster, which happened in the 1980s, and a large storm knocked over the Ocean Ranger. There were 84 individuals that perished, and subsequent to that, there was a Royal Commission report from which they found that the preparation, the safety devices were grossly inadequate. Centers were created both in Foxtrap out of St. John's, Newfoundland, as well as in Dartmouth in Nova Scotia, where individuals were trained in all the safety procedures that they could undertake, and as well as in helicopter egress. Individuals that work on the offshore oil installations, the majority of them travel by helicopter, and a ditching or a crash of a helicopter is usually followed by an inversion of the helicopter as the center of gravity is above the passenger compartment, and the egress from the helicopter is something that now all the individuals that are involved in offshore oil installations traveling with helicopters are involved in, and they're trained at one of these two centers or similar centers at other parts of the world. The survivability of individuals that are egressing from the helicopter appears to be dependent on their breath hold ability. So as I mentioned, the majority of them, 95% of them, commute by helicopters to oil installations, and a UK report by Michael Tipton showed that 83% of them survived the initial ditching or crashing of the helicopter into the water, and the majority of those, 82.6% of those, drown. And so the post-crash ditching survival rate appears to depend on their ability to breath hold. So when my lab was at Memorial University in Newfoundland, we focused on this particular aspect of survival in the offshore and looking at breath holding ability in the undersea. And to keep this serious topic as light as we can, so the sudden immersion has some consequences of it, and one of them is the ability to hold your breath appears to be dependent on the water temperature as well as on the sex of the individual. Before getting into some data, I'll just go through some schematics here to distinguish between the different types of shallow and deep water blackout and breath holding with and without hyperventilation. The data and the discussion I'm having today is not on the sport apnea group, which there's a huge explosion of sport apnea and some very interesting performances that are happening, but we focused on individuals, the regular day individuals that travel to and from the oil rigs who have no training whatsoever, because we were trying to get a gauge of what their ability is to hold their breath. So for a normal breath hold dive without any hyperventilation, this is the partial pressure of oxygen or carbon dioxide. It gives us a function of time, and the red line gives us oxygen, and the blue line gives us CO2. And during the dive, you're continuing to work as you swim, and the PO2 is decreasing, your oxygen stores are decreasing at the same time as your CO2 stores or production is increasing. At a certain point, there's a critical level at which you'll go to the surface and breathe, and subsequent to the dive, those partial pressures will recover. With a breath hold dive where the individual hyperventilates and provides or produces a hypocapnia prior to that, this can be a dangerous situation. Here we have the same graph across time for O2 and CO2, and the hyperventilation prior to the dive lowers the CO2, and during the dive that same oxygen consumption continues, and what ends up happening is they'll get a blackout point prior to that point where the CO2 level or production reaches a level where they will be ready to breathe, and they can pass out underwater. This can also happen in individuals in deeper dives where they're in scuba, or if they have insensitivity to CO2. So our focus was on, in this case, in the breath hold diving, but this work also applies to the individuals that are diving to deeper depths with scuba. So some of our work is given here where we have breath hold time given as a function of water temperature, and individuals held their breath for as long as they could, a male and a female group of 6 individuals in each group, and we saw that males consistently outperformed the females across the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different water temperatures. And we saw that the average times were considerably less than what the reports were for the time to egress from a helicopter. So the challenge remained for individuals to be able to egress from the helicopter. They had to have a breath hold time or another solution to be able to escape from the helicopter. This is the average times of the breath hold times divided by gender, and we can see that on average the men would outperform the women, providing an extra challenge for the individuals managing and providing safety advice for the individuals in the offshore. When we go past breath hold diving and go to longer dives with scuba gear or self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, we have the rapture of the deep, or l'ivresse des grands profondeurs, as Jacques Cousteau called, and this is nitrogen narcosis, and there's a gradual diminution of cognitive and performance of the individual. And with that, the one thing that I want to point out is that in addition to that, the density of the gas increases. I apologize, the images are a little small here, but if we look at the gas density as the depth of the dive increases, we have a progressive increase in the density of the gas. And the slides I'm going to present subsequently are on the control of breathing, and so to remove that effect and to remove some of the challenges of diving in conditions with increased pressure, we've used a method of simulating nitrogen narcosis in the lab. Here we use a sub-anesthetic dose of nitrous oxide or normoxic nitric oxide, and here there's 4 zones. Oh, sorry. Take me back. There we go. And the second zone here, where we have 26 to 45% normoxic nitric oxide, we have psychological changes and detachment, signs of sedation, which is very similar to the symptoms that we see in a normal nitrogen narcosis, where you're diving the individual under pressure in a hyperbaric chamber. So this is the approach we have chosen so that we can focus on changes in breathing induced by nitrogen narcosis independent of the gas density. So often in diving, the reflex is to think about individuals that are hypothermic, that is, their body temperatures have gone down. We've been focusing on just the opposite of that in hyperthermic conditions where their body temperatures have gone up. And with that, we've looked at the changes in ventilation and the components of ventilation during physical exertion in the undersea. Nitrogen narcosis, just a summary here of what we've looked at. These are some of the changes we see, but we also see changes in pulmonary ventilation. And some of the work from Dr. Mekjevic has shown that with full suit divers that are having hot water pumped down, they're becoming hyperthermic, and individuals that are working undersea can be in a situation of narcosis together with hyperthermia. So another focus in the lab, we've been looking at control of breathing in the heat, and one of the results we've been showing is individuals, as they become hyperthermic, they hyperventilate. And they show a phase of panting, a second phase of panting or thermal hyperpnea. And I don't have time to get into all the details of that here, but if you're interested, there's a review paper that describes that. So effectively, the remaining slides that brought us through the study of hyperthermia and nitrogen narcosis are focusing on hyperthermic exercise and individuals in simulated nitrogen narcosis. This is an example, passive hyperthermia, where individuals are warmed in a hot bath, so following a rest in a 40-degree bath, and this is their minute ventilation, followed by their oxygen consumption, respiratory quotient, and heart rate. And I'd just like you to focus on the top slide to see that we see about a 50% increase in their ventilation with just an increase in their core temperature from resting to about 38.5 to 39 degrees. And with that, if we plot ventilation against, excuse me, not doing too well with the pointer today. Ventilation against core temperature, we see distinct thresholds for either tympanic or esophageal core temperature, indicative of a ventilation threshold for hyperventilation. So the stages of ventilation during exercise, and this is now getting into the topic of exercise physiology as defined by de Jours years ago, is 3 stages for submaximal exercise. The onset, the change to a steady state, so 1, 2, and 3. And then subsequent to that, there is a increase in ventilation, a nonlinear increase in ventilation, or the ventilatory breakaway. So what we've done is focused on the different segments, and I'll present some data on the first section here, where individuals are in a steady state and in the conditions of hyperthermia together with nitrogen narcosis. The methods that we employed include 2 trials per subject where they were in a control condition, a normal thermia, just as pictured at the top on the left. Is an individual at 18 degrees ambient temperature wearing shorts and t-shirt. And then when we put the individual into the hyperthermic condition, put them in an impermeable rain suit, they exercise at 35 degrees Celsius, and we're able to induce a moderate hyperthermia in the individual. And with that, we follow their core temperature responses and skin temperatures, and in both cases, we can generate a moderate hyperthermia in the individual. So core temperature given at the top, skin temperature given as a function of the different periods where they're either breathing air, normoxic nitrous oxide, or air once again. When we look at their ventilation response, we can see that at the submaximal levels, ventilation does increase in the hyperthermic condition. So ventilation, tidal volume, and frequency of breathing given as a function of the different conditions of exercise. But we saw no additional effect of the nitrous oxide together with hyperthermia. So it appears, at least at the submaximal level, any influence of nitrous oxide on the breathing was negligible in the hyperthermic condition. When we look at the hyperventilation, PET CO2 and O2 indicators of hyperventilation across the different conditions, we can see a moderate hypocapnia in the hyperthermic condition and a moderate hyperoxia in the hyperthermic condition, supportive of that being a hyperventilation. And in addition to that, the oxygen consumption shows a trend to elevate, which might account for part of that increase. And the heart rate is indicative of during the thermal stress is also increased, which may be contributing to increased cardiac work and increased oxygen consumption. So if we move to the onset of exercise and the first stage that de jour is defined, we can look at the same type of protocol where here we're going to use 4 conditions. We'll have gas type, normothermic air or normothermic nitrous oxide, and then hyperthermic air and hyperthermic nitrous oxide, and so in a 2x2 model. And we preheat individuals in a hot tub, followed by a period on the bike where they'll do a 30-second warm-up and a 30-second all-out wind gate test for a supramaximal test. And during that time, we follow their ventilation to see how nitrous oxide or the nitric narcosis and hyperthermia are influencing their performance. And this is just to show that we, esophageal temperature across the different conditions, we're able to successfully give a moderate hyperthermia during the hyperthermic conditions. And when we look at ventilation, tidal volume, and frequency of breathing, we can see that irrespective of the gas type, we see a suppression of ventilation in the 2 nitrous oxide conditions, which are given on the the right of the graph for you. And that appears to be accounted for by a decrease in the frequency of breathing. When we move to the last stage, or the ventilatory breakaway stage of exercise ventilation, we can look at an incremental exercise test from rest to the point of exhaustion, and ventilation, tidal volume, and frequency of breathing are given again as a function of the relative intensity, or the percentage of maximum work rate. And we're seeing a suppression of ventilation relative to the air condition at the higher intensities, and this appears again to be accounted for by a change in the frequency of breathing. So to wrap up my talk, I'll look at a little bit on performance, and this, I have to say, a little bit was not some, I guess the best way to describe this, it wasn't something we intended to go out and do. One of the students in the lab was a professional cyclist, and when we were doing the wind gate test to look at the breathing, he was all interested in the output, and so we had to look. And so those same conditions that I just described, and here we have mean power, mean power given on the y-axis across those 4 conditions, and the term that is given here is interaction term. And what we see for the mean power in either the air or the nitrous oxide condition, we have a significant interaction between gas type and body temperature, such that when you are narked or have nitrous oxide and you're hyperthermic, we're seeing a significant increase in your performance. Here, given for mean power, if we go to the next slide, given for peak power, that same interaction, it's only a trend in this slide for the output for that interaction. But still, the suggestion is that perhaps reduction of the pain together with a passively induced hyperthermia is improving your performance. So that got us thinking, and we went on and thought, okay, what about aerobic exercise? Maybe if we narc people and give them an incremental exercise test from rest to the point of exhaustion, they'll improve their performance, their aerobic performance. This study is from Igor Mekjevic and Rita Kaimachela, where this is looking at oxygen consumption as a function of work rate. They did see at the maximum increase in performance in the nitrous oxide condition. So suggesting, as we saw for the wind gate test and for the supramaximal exercise, that there's an increase in performance. We went through the same study, and we're seeing pretty much the opposite. We have oxygen consumption given as a function of percent of maximal power, and we see that for this subset of 6 individuals with the nitrous oxide condition relative to the air condition, there's a suppression in performance, or a suppression in aerobic oxygen consumption at the different levels. So some future directions. The breath holding work and apnea training across the different sexes, I think, is an area that definitely needs attention, and across different water temperatures and different levels of training. As I mentioned, there's the whole apnea group, the sport divers, who are making these incredibly long static and dynamic apneas. We focused just on static apneas, and indeed, the apneas that these individuals would be undertaking during a helicopter egress would be a dynamic apnea. And I think there's a lot to be learned there. The egress bottles is, I think, still an ongoing area of investigation. I'm not 100% aware of what they did try to implement them at one point. So the egress bottle is effectively a mini scuba bottle that is given to the individual that they can use. It has enough gas in it for them to make that swim to the surface. So for the control of breathing area, we need to resolve the influence of the simulated nitrogen narcosis and hyperthermia on the components and timing of breathing. We've done a bunch of work on timing as well. I didn't have time to present today, but that will be helping us to understand the control of breathing in these divers. And lastly, this putative ergogenic effect of nitrous oxide at anaerobic capacity needs to be sorted out, because there's clearly conflicting results, and we need to figure out what's going on there. So in conclusion, from the study, we saw that 30% nitrous oxide appears during phase 1 and phase 3 to suppress exercise ventilation. The nitrous oxide suppressed during moderate hyperthermia and with 30% nitrous oxide, we had an increase in performance during short duration supermaximal exercise intensity, that is during the Wingate test. And this preliminary evidence suggests that aerobic capacity is suppressed, but indeed that isn't without exception, as there's a well-controlled studies that are published to show just the contrary. So I'd like to thank the sponsoring agencies for this work, as well as a list of trainees and students far too numerous to list, and without them we wouldn't be able to do any of this research. So thanks very much. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to take those.
Yeah. Hi, Ben Levine from Dallas. Thank you for your talk. I was a little bit confused about two things. I'm hoping you might be able to enlighten. The first is, are you suggesting that in this helicopter rescue scenario, with the passengers breathing atmospheric air, not compressed air, for a few seconds, that they're getting nitrogen narcosis? Is that what you're implying?
Not at all.
Okay. So there's no relationship between the nitrogen narcosis issue and the helicopter rescue, or is there?
No, there isn't.
Okay, good. I understood you then. The second issue relates to your simulation of nitrogen narcosis. So just because there's an N2 in the equation, do you think that means that this particular anesthetic agent is similar to nitrogen narcosis as opposed to xenon or propofol or any inhaled anesthetic? I'm not sure why an inhaled anesthetic should be considered the same as nitrogen narcosis.
Okay, excellent question. If you look at the Martin-Overton hypothesis and lipid solubility on the different anesthetics, there is definitely differences in the effect of the different anesthetics as a function of their lipid solubility. The nitrogen and nitrous oxide have different points on the curve, without a doubt. The decision, or within the field of the hyperbaric physiology field, to use nitrous oxide as an analog or something to simulate the narcosis is based mainly on the symptoms that are similar for the individuals at the zone 2 of that stage of anesthesia that we see with the nitrous oxide.
But isn't that true for any inhaled anesthetic agent? That's why they go through the same stages depending on the minimal alveolar concentration?
Sure. I mean, we haven't entertained looking at other types of anesthetics and what the benefits or challenges would be with the different anesthetics. I mean, helium is used, trimix is used by some of the divers. And there, for control of breathing studies, the density of the gas is an issue, again, because of the lower density of helium, and cooling of the individuals as well, because it'll pass right through the skin, and hypothermia becomes an issue with helium. So I'm not... I would say the choice was through convenience more, and that there was a considerable body of literature supporting the use of that percentage nitrous oxide as something to simulate the narcosis we see in divers.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. All right, great. Thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker tonight will be, or this afternoon I should say, will be Dr. Michael Koehle. He's a director of the Environmental Physiology Laboratory and associate professor of kinesiology and sports medicine at the University of British Columbia. He practices clinical sport and exercise medicine at the Allen McGavin Sports Medicine Center at UBC. He's also an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University, and his research is focused on the physiological responses to environmental stressors such as air pollution and altitude.
Thank you, Julien, and thank you to the organizing committee for approving this symposium and for having us as speakers. So I'm just going to start my little timer there. So I think I already skipped through the conflicts of interest, but I really don't have anything to declare, so that was simple. So I'd like to start with just a bit of background in terms of altitude. We are across the street from the ocean, so naturally we're at sea level. So we're at the sort of bottom, almost as low as we can go in terms of altitude. And as we know, as you get higher, the ambient pressure decreases. The column of air on top of you is less, so the pressure gets less as you go higher. So this is just a bit of a schematic of increasing altitude and decreasing barometric pressure. And the actual concentration or the fraction of oxygen that's in the air, that doesn't change the higher you go in terms of altitude, but because the ambient pressure is less, there's just less molecules around you. So this, if we leave Victoria and we go up to 5,000 meters, which is the level of the sort of highest human continuous habitation, we get a 50% reduction in oxygen around us. If we go one level higher, up to the summit of Mount Everest, which is about 8,850 meters. So that's take Whistler and then put 3 more Whistlers on the top of Whistler and then stand on the top of that. You're getting about, whoops, I missed, but a quarter of the oxygen that we have here in Victoria in this room. So that is naturally a stress on the body, and one of the manifestations of that stress, or the key one that we'll be talking about today, is altitude illness. And there's many conditions that can affect you as you go to altitude, but the 3 main acute altitude illnesses that we hear people talk about are acute mountain sickness, the most common, and then high altitude cerebral edema, which is could be thought of as a progression of severe acute mountain sickness, but where you have really significant neurological symptoms, alteration in the level of consciousness, proceeding to coma and even death. So that's much more severe. And then also a somewhat separate entity is high-altitude pulmonary edema, which affects primarily the lungs. And the symptoms you see with that are initially poor exercise tolerance and shortness of breath, but that progresses to cough and really severe hypoxemia and also death as well. So we're going to just focus on the research around acute mountain sickness today. One of the things I didn't mention was that altitude illness is mainly a feature above 3,000 meters. Some people, if you've chosen your parents incorrectly, they will you can succumb to altitude illness at slightly lower levels, or if you have a cardiorespiratory illness that will affect your oxygenation. But generally, it's around 3,000 meters or 10,000 feet where that would start to come on. So we can deal with the stress of altitude through acclimatization, and It affects a variety of systems throughout the body, but very briefly, the important things that happen is that there's an increase in ventilation that is sustained, increase in cardiac output. Early on, you get hemoconcentration, and then over time, over a period of days to weeks to months, you'll get an increase in the actual red blood cell mass. And those factors improve oxygen delivery to the brain and the other tissues, and that's how we deal with it. The thing is, people acclimatize differently and at different rates. And so acute mountain sickness has this kind of odd name with sickness in it, and it can be thought of as a disease or a condition, but it can also be thought of as a sort of a delay in acclimatization, in that some people on the same itinerary will be able to ascend quite quickly without any symptoms, and then someone else who's equally healthy and equally fit may have symptoms consistent with acute mountain sickness. And so sometimes we categorize them into people who are AMS, acute mountain sickness susceptible, and people who are AMS resistant. But also another way of thinking about it is people that are acclimatizing more rapidly and people that are acclimatizing more slowly. Because if you, myself, I tend to get acute mountain sickness more than my peers, but if I have acute mountain sickness at a certain altitude, and if I stay there long enough without any medication and without going higher, those symptoms will resolve. So I will become acclimatized to that altitude. So I'm a bit of a slow acclimatizer. And so that's sort of the question that I'm going to sort of address today with what we're talking about. And it's really important to realize that the focus today is just on that sort of acclimatization and the illness side of things. And I'm not talking about performance at altitude, exercise performance when competing at altitude. That's a separate issue. And then altitude training for sea level performance, that is another issue. And they're things that they're separate issues that need to be studied differently and considered differently. So the question is, how do we predict who is more likely to get ill or who is more of a slow acclimatizer? And so I like to start with this super busy picture. It's from a paper by Gallagher and Hackett. But basically what you see is the incidence of AMS all over the world. And I won't let you spend your time going through it, but if you look at the Himalayas, that's where the highest mountains are, the incidence of AMS over the course of a sojourn is about 23%. But then if you go here, this is the one that counts in Hawaii and Mauna Kea, the incidence is 93%. So many of you can probably figure out why that is. It's probably not macadamia nuts or something like that, but why is it 93% there in Hawaii? So just yell it out if you know it. Anyone? Speed of ascent. It's because there's a road. And so you can get to sea level up to 4,000 meters in 3 hours. And there were some early studies of ginkgo that did that, and they just threw a bunch of people in a bus and drove up the mountain as quickly as possible, and to see how people coped with the ascent. Whereas in the Himalayas, there's a lot of places where the roads are poor or there's no roads, and so you have to trek on foot, and it takes a lot longer to get up to that altitude. So the most important risk factor is always speed of ascent or your itinerary, and that's not very controversial. So the International Climbing Association, they have recommendations on sort of how quickly you can go. And their key recommendation is once you get over that 2,500 to 3,000 meter level, you want to take your time and progress slowly and maybe even take a day off every 2 to 4 days. What they really are saying is, allow your body to acclimatize and don't sort of rely on medications or drugs to do that unless there's extenuating circumstances. So that makes sense. One of the things that often you hear and are taught is that previous history is really important. And so people who have had a history of one of the altitude illnesses in the past, they're more likely to have it again. And this is most true with high-altitude pulmonary edema, which is quite different from the other conditions. And there have been many studies performed on, a small group of people that keep getting high-altitude pulmonary edema, and they're quite almost reliable and foolhardy, I guess, in signing up for these studies, and they will get high altitude pulmonary edema, and that's how they were testing things like Cialis, Viagra's buddy, and salmeterol, which is a puffer as preventive medications for high altitude pulmonary edema. These people were so reliable at getting it and so willing to join the study and get this lethal condition. It's not quite so clear with acute mountain sickness as it is with high altitude pulmonary edema, and we'll talk about that a little bit. One of the PhD students, Martin McInnes, in our group, he was going to devote his PhD into looking at acute mountain sickness, and he thought if he's going to do a bunch of interventions in the chamber and look at susceptibility, he wanted to figure out really how effective the chamber was at actually making people sick and how reliable that was. So what he did is he took 25 people, men and women, and had them come to the chamber 3 times. 2 of those times it was at altitude at 4,000 meters. And one of those times it was a sham condition. So made all the sound. We took it up to just a few hundred meters, but experientially, other than maybe some shortness of breath, it was supposed to be a similar experience. It was done in random order with a washout of a couple weeks in between. And what we found is predictably, we found that in the hypoxia condition, after 12 hours in the chamber, people had more severe symptoms of acute mountain sickness. That's good. And they had less severe symptoms after the sham condition. They still felt kind of gross. The symptoms of acute mountain sickness are a bad hangover. So malaise, headache, nausea, dizziness, fatigue, poor sleep. And so if you're coming into a strange lab that's a little bit messier than it should be and a little bit foreign, and you're sleeping with a stranger overnight, you're probably going to have some of those symptoms anyway, even if you're at sea level. And so that's why we're not getting 0 in the sham condition. But the really interesting thing was that the people that got acute mountain sickness the first time weren't always the same people that got it the second time. And so if you got symptoms of acute mountain sickness on the first day, you only had a 56% chance of having it on the second day. And that was kind of disappointing. And if you didn't have it on the first day, there was a 50% chance that you're not going to have it on the second day. So we're sort of in the territory of flipping a coin to predict it. And so that was interesting but disappointing. So what Martin did is he went and he looked at all the studies that he could find that had more than one altitude or simulated altitude exposure, and quantified the severity of acute mountain sickness to try to figure out if in the first exposure how that would predict your response in the second exposure. And then what he did is he plotted all the studies that met the criteria. There were 17 of them based on sort of sensitivity and specificity. And then he did this receiver-operator characteristic of putting sort of the data of all the studies together. And what he found was that really the sensitivity was right around 50%. So on that first exposure, if you had acute mountain sickness, your chance of having it in the second exposure was about 50%. So that's not very impressive. There's issues with a lot of the studies, but that certainly was an eye-opener, having that first experience in the lab and then with the meta-analysis. So in terms of sort of a interim summary, usually when I'm watching these presentations, I get lost, and then I'm screwed for the next 20 minutes. So I put these interim summaries in just for me, actually. So acute mountain sickness is a way of thinking about slow acclimatization. Itineraries are really important. Previous history doesn't seem to be as helpful as previously believed. Do I take it into account with my patients? I still take it into account a little bit, but perhaps not as much as with some of the other conditions. So what about physiology predictors? So a few of these would make good sense. Oxygen saturation. So you go to an altitude and say you're at 4,000 meters, you may find that some people have an oxygen saturation of 90% and some people have an oxygen saturation of 76%. And you'd think the people with the lower oxygen saturation would be the people that are more at risk of having acute mountain sickness, and that would make sense. And so that would something that we wanted to look at. Heart rate variability, we did a really small pilot study when I worked here in this little town here in the bottom corner there. We were working in a clinic for a few months at 3,680 meters, and we just sort of measured really crudely on just the 3 doctors and the nurse that worked in the clinic over the course of their time there. We looked at their heart rate measures and kind of a crude measure of that, and we thought, hey, you know what, maybe there's some potential here. So I thought, okay, well, how can I actually study this in more than 4 people? And so while I was working there, one of the local Nepalis that worked for the same NGO, the Himalayan Rescue Association, his name is Gobi Bashial, he told me about this other place called Gosain Kunda. And it's a holy lake in central Nepal. Tourists don't go there very much, but on the first full moon in August, there's a festival there. And it's at 4,380 meters. And over a period of just 2 to 3 days, approximately 12,000 people go to that festival. And these are 12,000 people, the majority of them are lowlanders. Because in Nepal, the majority of people are lowlanders. It's just when you watch the Everest movie or whatever and you hear about Sherpas, they're highlanders, but they're a small percentage of the population. So you're getting about 12,000 lowlanders coming up very quickly from the area around the capital, Kathmandu, which is about 1,400 meters, which is I guess a little bit lower than Denver, that kind of area. But they go up to 4,380 meters over the course of about 36 hours. So very quickly, these altitude-naive people go up, and 68% of them get sick. So I heard that, and I thought, well, that's fantastic for me. And there's a temporary health camp there every year initially they were there for just, I think, 36 hours, but now they've made it sort of longer, 72 hours. But you can see, up to 700 patients over that period. You don't typically get a good chance to get a good sort of social history, how was your upbringing, that kind of thing, when you're seeing 700 patients in 72 hours. But if you do the math, that's a lot of people with acute mountain sickness. So I got excited and I volunteered to go to work at this camp the next year, the year after that, and then 3 years after that. And it actually doesn't look like this. This is sort of the 10 seconds over the week that it's not raining. It's a pretty miserable place, and there's no sanitation whatsoever. So it's I think it's kind of like Woodstock was in terms of sanitation. And so this is a quick tour of the hospital. This is the minor surgery area. This is the intensive care unit. That is the entire oxygen supply. This is the waiting room and the doctor's office, and the pharmacy is down there in the bottom. And this is the ambulance, right? So this is a sick person with a little bit of oxygen in a basket on someone's back. And so if someone is really sick, they need to get out of there quickly. The first thing you actually do is you start getting people collecting money to hire a porter. That's the first part of your evacuation plan. So anyone who knows Jordan Gannett will like to see these pictures of Jordan. He's collecting some DNA here and doing some anthropometric measurements. And there's Martin McInnes. He's measuring balance. We're not going to talk about balance today, though. And so the first thing we did was look at those sort of low-hanging fruit, oximetry, heart rate, and heart rate variability. And we collected out of those people that presented to the clinic, we actually set up our own little area that's quite scientific here. This was the laboratory. We found a couple of sheets and a camping mat and a thick blanket. And we had it walled off from the rest of the clinic. And we recruited about 41 people, half of them who had gotten sick, had gotten up to that altitude and got acute mountain sickness, half that didn't. And then we just measured oxygen saturation while they were supine, as undisturbed as was realistic. and we measured heart rate variability, or just with a simple polar heart rate monitor. And what we found was really essentially nothing other than that the heart rate, the oxygen saturation was slightly lower in the people that got acute mountain sickness than those that didn't. So that's what we were kind of hoping for. And we did this receiver-operator characteristic to look at the oxygen saturation in the people who were sick and those that weren't. And you'll see that the error bars on this are very wide, and so that gives you a bit of pause. But what we found was that if you had an oxygen saturation of 96% of the people that got AMS had an oxygen saturation of 86% or less. So you could kind of take that and interpret it as at 4,380 meters in people that have ascended 2,000 meters over the last day, if their oxygen saturation is above 86%, they have quite a low chance of having acute mountain sickness. So that was encouraging, but on subsequent trips, we were spending more time really trying to collect DNA and look on the genetic side of things, and we hadn't set up our little fastidious laboratory there and had 10 minutes to measure oxygen saturation. It was sort of this thing we were doing on the side. And so it was more just kind of pop the oximeter on Julien here for about 5 seconds, look at the number and write it down. And so when we tried to replicate the findings, there was no association. And so I'm wondering if part of it has to do with just the way that you measure oxygen saturation. And so on any subsequent trips, we haven't really prioritized that, and so we haven't measured oxygen saturation sort of undisturbed over a 10-minute period. So it might be related to that. If you look at the literature, there is a lot of, it's quite conflicting as to whether oxygen saturation is all that useful in acute mountain sickness. Definitely, if someone comes in and their oxygen saturation is 45%, I'm personally going to take that person a little more seriously than if it's 90%. So for big swings, especially with the more severe conditions, I think it is helpful within the limitations of oxygen saturation measurement, which we can talk about another time. But for the small differences, it's probably not that helpful. At that time, we also started collecting DNA from as many people as possible, and over 4 trips, we've collected about 700 DNA samples from people who made that journey that got sick and people that made that journey that didn't get sick. And we initially did this sort of candidate gene approach, so we started looking with this polymorphism of the angiotensin-converting enzyme. It's this insertion-deletion polymorphism that had been reported to predict high-altitude mountaineering success, which is different from acute mountain sickness, but we thought that was a good one to look at. We looked at nitric oxide synthase 3 gene, which is responsible for levels of endothelial and nitric oxide, and then we looked at a few others. We did find a little association with the NOS3 gene, the people that had the allele that increased endothelial and nitric oxide were slightly less likely to have acute mountain sickness. We also looked at that gene in Quechua, South American highland natives, and they were also overrepresented for that one allele. So that was kind of interesting. It hasn't been reproduced, and there is a study with a not dissimilar design in Han Chinese that has no association there. And with these genetic studies, it's really important to reproduce the study in a different population because there's a lot of chance to get a false positive, and so you really want to do the reproduction to really be a little more confident. So then next thing we did is we use a different technique called a genome-wide association study, where you don't really have that hypothesis beforehand about what particular gene you're going to look at. You try to just sort of look at the whole genome and then try to correct for doing so many comparisons. When we did that, we found one location. It's the FAM149A, which is leads to, it's expressed in neurologic tissue, especially in the trigeminal ganglion, which if you think about AMS having a headache and trigeminal nerve being involved sometimes in headaches, it sort of you could make some rationale that might play a role. But then what we did is we actually ended up looking at it in different populations, and that association didn't hold up. And so that's one of the things. We've done a series of papers looking at all the sort of genetic associations that have been done over time. And one of the problems that you'll find is that you see all these potential genes and the condition they relate to, but they either haven't been replicated or it hasn't, or it's attempted replication and it hasn't come through. The only one on this table is for chronic mountain sickness, which is sort of another entity entirely. The other possibility is chemosensitivity. So certain people will, when exposed to hypoxia, they'll breathe more than others. And it would make sense that the people that are the heavy breathers or the people that respond more briskly to hypoxia are going to breathe more, and they'll be better oxygenated and they won't get sick, and perhaps they'll acclimatize better. And early on in the 80s, there were some studies that showed, well, maybe that's helpful, but then there have been, again, it's been quite conflicting since then. So when we were looking at that, we got a little bit sidetracked. This work is the master's thesis of Normand Richard, who's here tonight. And we wanted to look at another question, which is sort of, are all altitude or hypoxia exposures the same? So the three main or three biggest ways that people get exposed to hypoxia is, you go to the top of a mountain. Yeah, that makes sense. Or you go into a hypobaric chamber, a chamber where you can reduce the pressure, the same as at the top of the mountain, but you don't mess around with the oxygen concentration. Or the more common one, especially in sport, is the normobaric hypoxia chamber, where you don't adjust the pressure at all, but you bleed in, you add extra nitrogen to reduce the fraction of inspired oxygen. And so you can, with all of these methods, you can achieve the same altitude, but there's differences. There's differences in pressure, differences in nitrogen concentration, and so there has been a lot of discussion about how equivalent these stressors are. And when you're thinking about the equivalence of these, you also have to think about what we were talking about at the beginning, in that there may be differences in terms of altitude training. That doesn't mean that there's differences in terms of exercise performance while you're in one of these chambers, and that doesn't equate to a difference in acclimatization or risk of illness. So again, there's separate questions. And so and the other thing is that the studies that do try to compare them, they compare them over quite different time frames. So from the sort of aviation world, often it's just minutes. So if there's a explosive decompression with an airplane, you're going to have very severe hypoxia very quickly. And then there's, from the altitude training studies, you're looking at weeks of altitude exposure. And then in the middle, there's studies over the hour period. So it's a bit of a mess. But we thought we'd take a crack at it. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to be really good at the blinding part of it. Because if you're comparing someone's holiday on the top of the mountain to someone sitting inside basically a glorified massive tic-tac, you're going to have a lot of other confounding variables such as noise, the claustrophobia, heat, all that kind of stuff. You go away on a vacation or an altitude training camp, there's a lot of other interventions other than the hypoxia there. You're in that camp environment, you're surrounded by athletes, you're there for one reason, you probably have to deal with less emails and phone calls and work and all that kind of stuff. So there's all these other co-interventions that allow for a big placebo effect when comparing each of these mechanisms. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to sort of control that as much as possible. And this is the chamber at Simon Fraser University that they were using, and the chamber director, Sherry Ferguson, is a bit of a wizard with it, in that she can control it, and even during a sham exposure, she still makes all the noise and makes your ears pop and all that. So she was quite effective in terms of the blinding. Only one subject really figured it out, and he was a kinesiology student, and he realized when he opened his water bottle at one point that it didn't really pop, and so he figured out when he was in the sham condition. And so this is the subjects inside playing cards. There's Normand there doing a chemosensitivity measure. But the conditions that we used more conditions than usual. So we used hypobaric hypoxia. You lower the pressure, you don't do anything to the oxygen, and we took people up to a simulated altitude about 4,500 meters. And so that's pretty standard. Then what we did is, using the same chamber, which often isn't done in the studies, we didn't do anything with the pressure. We just added lots of nitrogen to make it less, to make it hypoxic. Still made the noise, made their ears pop and all that. And then we did hypobaric normoxia. So we took the ambient pressure down to a level consistent with the 4,500 meters, but we added extra oxygen so that their sea level, they were at a sea level partial pressure of oxygen, but an ambient pressure like similar to altitude. And then we had the full sham, which was just sea level and pressure and oxygen level. And because the chamber at Simon Fraser University, I think, is about 440 meters, we actually did bring them down to sea level for that. So in terms of the blinding and the control, I thought it was pretty good. So we wanted to look at sort of acclimatization through severity of acute mountain sickness, and we wanted to look at chemosensitivity with this study. And so we looked at hypoxic ventilatory response, which is briefly your breathing air, your maintained isocapnic, and then a nitrogen is added to make you progressively more hypoxic, and then you just sort of quantify the increase in ventilation with that. And then we used a couple of different measures of chemosensitivity developed by Jim Duffin in Toronto, which look more at the carbon dioxide side of it, looking at the carbon dioxide threshold, above which you start to breathe more, and then the rate at which you breathe above that carbon dioxide threshold. And so it was a crossover design. Everybody did every exposure in a balanced random fashion with a washout of at least 2 weeks. We always have to do that washout period naturally. And so in terms of the physiological parameters, you can see here there's two lines that are superimposed, and that's the sham exposure. Sorry, this is for oxygen saturation. That's the sham exposure and the hypobaric normoxia, so the two normoxia. So they're right over top each other, so that's good. So the lowering the pressure without messing with the oxygen doesn't seem to do much in terms of saturation, heart rate, or ventilation. And then the two hypoxia exposures here, the normobaric and the hypobaric, they seem to line up quite nicely as well. So in our 6-hour exposure, we're not seeing a lot of values, a lot of difference there between the conditions. In terms of the severity of acute mountain sickness, conveniently half the subjects got acute mountain sickness and half of them didn't, and that worked out quite well. And there's a significant difference in the Lake Louise score, which is the score that we used to grade the severity of acute mountain sickness, between the people that got sick and didn't, which makes sense, but not between the conditions. So when you're comparing people to themselves, we didn't have a difference there. So over this sort of 6-hour period, we're not seeing much of a difference in terms of altitude illness. In terms of chemosensitivity, that hypoxic ventilatory response, where we make them more hypoxic and look at how much they breathe, that didn't change with the hypoxia exposure, and it wasn't different across conditions. And then with the carbon dioxide measures of chemosensitivity, what we found is that after the hypoxic exposures, people's carbon dioxide threshold was lower. So they started breathing dramatically more at a lower carbon dioxide level. So that's how their breathing was stimulated. But again, there wasn't a difference across conditions. And neither the chemosensitivity measures were helpful in predicting who was getting sick and who wasn't. So it was nice in that it was nicely blinded, but we're looking at just the 6-hour time frame. So you can't generalize that to a much shorter time frame or a longer time frame. And again, you can't generalize that to performance or training studies in terms of altitude. So I'm kind of running out of time, or I've run out of time. So in terms of a summary, my goal at the beginning of this journey was to try to figure out a way to predict who's going to be a good acclimatizer and who's a poor acclimatizer. And the obvious thing, itinerary worked, oximetry was, the jury's still out, but it's not good for small differences, perhaps massive differences. And then previous history is less predictive than we would have thought, and heart rate variability and chemosensitivity weren't very helpful. And then again, looking at the different methods or treatments of hypobaric versus normobaric hypoxia, we couldn't see a difference. One of the stressors that we have in our chamber that in this study that we can't control, and which is something that I think we don't think about, especially one of the other things we study a lot is air pollution and exercise, is noise. And it's not something that we're really addressing properly, is the stress of noise. And I think going forward we need to sort of take that into account, because if you're on top of a beautiful mountain in the crisp air, that's a little different from any kind of chamber exposure. So it's something we totally neglected, but it's worth looking at. So lots of people have been involved in these studies, and I have to thank the participants as well in the field studies and the lab studies, and all the people that have worked in the environmental physiology lab and have helped with all this. So that's it. Thanks. Oh.
Great talk.
Thanks.
In the last study you discussed, did that rule where the same people don't necessarily repeatedly get symptoms, did that hold for that as well?
You know, it's interesting. I was actually wondering that question while I was looking at that slide 2 minutes ago, because I was thinking the study where we sort of did the meta-analysis was actually after this, and so I don't know. I have to look at that. I think it held better in this situation than it did in the other study, which was a normobaric chamber. That's my guess. Norma, was that your sense, that it was more predictable? So this was more controlled, better blinding, shorter exposure, and so it felt like it did, but we haven't analyzed it. But obviously, it's a great question.
Hello, thanks
Hi.
for your talk. A number of years ago, I was doing a series of altitude training camps, and my sister was having a lot of trouble with those camps, so I was doing a lot of research. And I came across a paper that suggested that women on birth control pills suffered from more acute mountain sickness. And I was wondering if that is true.
Yeah, so I haven't seen that study. When you talk about birth control pills, there's a lot of variety, right?
I think this was specifically more estrogen related, but I'm not sure.
Because progesterone can be a respiratory stimulant, which you'd think would be protective.
Mm-hmm. And I thought that the estrogen would be more protective in terms of increased endothelial function and stuff. So yeah, I was just confused by that.
Yeah, and so I'm not aware of any studies that have shown that. They've looked a lot at clots at altitude, because especially if you're stuck in a tent for 3 days or that kind of thing, and there hasn't been any association actually with mountaineering and clots or with oral contraceptives and that. And then if you sort of step back and talk about sort of the sex differences in risk of acute mountain sickness, the consensus is probably there is no sex difference. You'll find studies that say there are, and we've done a study that said that women were more at risk, but sort of on balance, it seems that there isn't much of a difference there. And the same thing with age. There were some early studies saying that being older is protective, and old people, and it's either a common sense. So the older people would say it's common sense, and younger people would say that it's the sort of the shrunken brain hypothesis that they just have more space, kind of like Homer Simpson. But there's probably a mix of common sense and no association. So.
Yeah. Hey there. I'm just curious if you're aware of any evidence that says whether or not someone doing a first-time acclimatization would be a little bit more affected rather than someone who maybe has acclimatized many, many times throughout their history, and even if it's after a full washout period of even a few months, if they've just done it multiple times as opposed to that first time.
All this stuff is quite dirty in that there's sort of a lot of inputs to how you're feeling and how you're doing in terms of hydration, ascent rate, and all that. So your first ascent, you'd be quite inexperienced, and you may actually be, I know for me, I was like, oh, is this it? Is this a headache? Is this a headache kind of thing? And then over time, you're gonna have a different itinerary. You're gonna be more relaxed. You're gonna take care of your nutrition, your hydration better, and all that. So there's all these other inputs that play a role. Famously, Sir Edmund Hillary felt it was the opposite, that as he got older and over time it got worse. But not that we know of it in terms of the pure physiology of it, but it would be hard to test.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for a great talk, Michael. There's been some recent sort of discussion about the sleep question on the Lake Louise score, and that it maybe it's not part of the etiology of AMS. So do you think that if you took that out, and that might be maybe some change, who is AMS positive or negative, have you thought about doing any of that, like reanalyzing some of your data and see if that makes a difference at all?
So we did, and so what we did is it was Martin McInnes who did the meta-analysis of the repeatability. He also did a factor analysis of the Lake Louise score, and basically it's 5 different things, and you can get a score up to 3 in each of them, and it's sort of basically how much do each of them relate to each other. And basically, sleep is over here, and then the rest are all together. And at the same time, out of Scotland, there was a similar study with similar findings. And if you look at this slide right here, this was a Normand study, which was 6 hours during the day. So we just forgot about sleep, and so it looks very clean. The people that don't get sick, their Lake Louise score is practically 0, and that's really nice and tidy. If you go back to the one done in the chamber where they're sleeping overnight, it's a lot messier because of that sleep. And there's so many things that can interfere with sleep. On an expedition or even in a chamber, just the claustrophobia. Often you're on vacation, you're drinking, you're partying, or you're on medication, acetazolamide that makes you have to get up and pee, that kind of thing. So it's just, there's a lot more inputs into it and a lot of reasons why you wouldn't sleep well. So yeah, I would heartily endorse considering it without the sleep.
All right. Thank you everyone for coming this evening, and please join me in thanking our speakers. And enjoy your evening in Victoria.